Hey, my name is Deanna Levy, and I'm a journalist who hosts and produces a podcast called Generation Cult. On each show, I interview a person who was raised in an isolated, authoritarian, high-demand group, also known as a cult. And side note, I also grew up in one myself. Chances are you've never even heard of some of these organizations, but others we discuss have made some serious headlines over the years. Either way, these episodes focus on the stories of people who didn't choose to join. They were either born into or brought into these groups by parents or guardians as a child. Many of them grew up isolated from mainstream society and had a lot of catching up to do when they finally left their groups. On the podcast, we discuss their experiences in the cult, but most importantly, we covered their journeys out and the lives they built after the cult. Some of these stories are really disturbing, while others deal with more subtle forms of coercion and control. Please join me every 2 weeks for a new episode of Generation Cult, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts.
To captive hearts and minds, to all my friends of yesterday who view me now as dead, I think of you when I wake up and when I go to bed. For 40 years our captors ruled, that only friends within, the prison where they held our hearts, were viewed as next of kin. Where strangers were our brothers true, the reason, shared belief. But now the truth I can't accept, there's none, just deathly grief. For you I've left to chant and pray, I watch you in that tower. Your captive minds have failed to see, manipulating power. For you I understand escape is not what you desire, your place of safety, well from harm and everlasting fire. The food you eat to build your souls you take without a doubt, sustaining all your faith that you will never go without. But please, I beg, don't view me as a man without good cause. Don't see me as a renegade against your protective laws. It's not the freedom I desired, I never felt imprisoned. But leave my friends and family there? It's not what I envisioned. But now I'm out, I look around, I see that I was blind. The jailers of our minds and hearts did not want us to find that there was love and good and heart outside the tower gates, that educating one's own mind would lead to selfish traits. If only you would pause for thought and ponder on how mad that playing with a plastic toy could ever make God sad. How shunning me and those who can't proclaim that God knows all, that from the start he let the pain still knowing we would fall. Why can't you see that this makes you accessory to the crime? I can't condone a God who cares, who says, it's not my time. It's evil, wicked, heinous, vile to let a baby die, and worse to know right from the start and have your reasons why. So don't look down from high above your tower window seat and judge me for the stand I take or preach the end I'll meet. Don't feel for me, don't patronize my exit from your cult, when you won't even test your faith to see what might result. For no one ever should declare their truth is pure and real, without first testing from all sides or making strong appeal to reason, logic, balanced thought, and see if it withstands the scrutiny and tough review before we raise our hands. I know you think you've done just that. I know you think you're free. It only takes a moment's thought to see what I can see. The risk is great to shun your friends, to cut your family ties, when evidence for all your trust is all but laboured lies. If pain you feel at loyal deeds are making you feel sad, then fear not questions, fear not doubt. There's learning to be had. This leadership must prove itself by independent trial. Resist its hold on human hearts. Please stop to see its guile. And when you understand that I have questions they can't crack, you'll start to see why I can say, I'm never going back. The tower's tall, the leaders high, they rule you as a slave. Don't let them fool you with their hope unto that lonely grave. This is a poem by Watchtower Free on an ex-Jehovah's Witness website. I will link to this in the episode description. This poem holds particular relevance to today's conversation. Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series on the Jehovah's Witnesses with Daniel O'Brien. I'm your speaker, Casey, and for this 3-part episode, Daniel and I will discuss the hypocrisy of religion, the difficulties of the shunning process, and rebuilding an entire life after being disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses organisation. For early access to full-length ad-free content, please visit patreon.com/thecultvault and sign up for as little as £1 a month. But for now, here is Daniel. So hello, Daniel, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about your experiences in the Jehovah's Witnesses. I've been interested in learning more about your story personally since watching your recent ICSA panel. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure, and thanks for having me on your program. Yes, my name is Daniel O'Brien, and I was in the Jehovah's Witness cult for about 25 years, 20 of which I served as an elder in the congregation, which for people who may not be familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, it's kind of like being a priest in the Catholic Church as far as the title and the authority, although it's without any of the education or training. To be a Catholic priest, you have to go through years of seminary, and it's quite intensive. And whether you agree with that or not, at least they have a lot of training. For witnesses for a person to be an elder in the congregation, you just have to show up to a lot of meetings for a bunch of years, answer a few questions, and they do have occasional workshops, but it's scant. And the travesty of it is that there's this focus on a form of education, but there's not the content or the depth. And so elders are woefully unprepared for dealing with the things they have to. And that's important to me because education has always been something that I've been very interested in. Towards the end of my years in the cult, I went back to university, something which is highly frowned upon by the religion. I pursued a degree first in music education and became a band director here and taught at high schools for many years. Then I added a science credential. So now I currently teach all the sciences at the school I'm at, all the hard sciences, earth science, biology, chemistry, physics, and also psychology. And I also pursued a master's degree in education. So education, real education, and the benefits that it gives to us as individuals, critical thinking skills, but also as a teacher and educator to help my students to develop their own critical thinking skills, which is so important for so many reasons.
When you were in the organization, how was it put to you that further education was something not to be pursued? And how do you understand that today in terms of the real reasons why the organization wouldn't want somebody to pursue further education?
Well, that's a really great question. Jehovah's Witnesses, like many cults and many controlling individuals, often are very subtle about things. They'll say, oh, we don't make rules. But then they'll say things like, a spiritual person wouldn't do this, wink, wink. And so it's highly manipulative. And you hear things like that, and you want to be a good person, you want to be a good member of the organization, a good cult member, although you'd never say that at the time, right? And so it's very subtle, it's very insidious. And they do have outright statements that pursuing higher education is not something for Christians. My father, I was not raised in this religion. My father one time asked me why my older son was not going to pursue college. And I sent him a statement, and I don't remember it verbatim at this point, but basically it said that universities was part of Satan's system of things. And that's why my son Andrew was not going to go to college. This was after I had left the religion, but my dad could not understand why my son wouldn't go. And so you're constantly barraged with this message, as well as others, that these are things not to do. Witnesses have a lot of rules. There was even a circuit judge here in California that one time made a comment that Jehovah's Witnesses had an astounding number of rules. Well, if a judge in the California judicial system says that a religion has a lot of rules, they have a lot of rules. So how do I think about that? You asked about, could you rephrase the question about time?
Yeah, it's just interesting how high demand religious groups position it, why you shouldn't go for further education, and then the true reasons behind it typically like because you shouldn't give your time to anyone else or your money to anyone else and this, that, and the other?
Well, right. There's the explicit reason. It's part of Satan's system of things. A true Christian wouldn't do that. You should be busy serving Jehovah, not serving yourself and seeking selfish things. So those are the official reasons. But I've come to believe that while there is some jealousy there, and a lot of high control groups act like a jealous partner in a codependent relationship, that there's also the knowledge that people who do go and pursue higher education, they learn to think critically and they start realizing that a lot of the teachings of the group are unsound. They're bullshit. Can I say that? Are we allowed to swear here? And so that certainly happened to me when I went back to college and I was starting to learn different things and think critically. I started turning that lens on my belief system, and it's like a tapestry. So you start pulling on this thread and that thread, and pretty soon the whole thing just falls apart. And then you go, fuck, I'm in a cult. And so then there's the whole thing about how do you get out of that when you're so entrenched, which is a long story in itself.
You mentioned that this was not a group that you were born into, and in our conversations, I'm aware that you joined in your 20s. So what was your life like leading up to this point? Were you brought up in any type of religious household? And were you in an area that was quite prolific for witnesses, or was it something that you just kind of naturally yourself moved towards?
Yes. So my parents were both born in the 30s and grew up post-Depression. And they were both raised in very religious households, my father as a Catholic and my mother as a Methodist. But by the time they got together and had me, they had both pretty much abandoned their religion. We never went to any church at all as when I was a child, and my dad is an atheist. My mom recently has started going back to church, interestingly, as she's gotten older. But this religion was never a thing when my older sister and I were kids. And my dad remarried and I have three younger half siblings. They never went to church. It just wasn't a thing. And so even the subject of spirituality was not something that was really discussed. So in my middle teens, I picked up the guitar and got very interested in that. When I was 17, I actually left high school early, went to college, and realized that music was a passion of mine. I started trying to learn more about music. And as you learn about the music throughout Europe's history, I particularly fell in love with the music of J.S. Bach. It was hard for me to understand a lot of the things he wrote without understanding the context historically of what was going on. And of course, well, people who were into his music know he was very prolific as writing music for liturgical music, sacred music. He was Lutheran. And I started being really interested in, since I was not raised religiously, how could these belief systems be so powerful for almost 2,000 years in Europe? I know that's oversimplifying it, but that was the initial question that pulled me in. So I started studying history. I started getting interested in religion. And I read what a lot of different religions had to say about things, and not just Christian faiths, but I did look at Judaism and Islam and Buddhism, and pretty much confined it to that. And I was attracted to some of the teachings of Christianity, but I felt like none of the religions were really teaching it. And now that sounds so strange because I certainly don't believe Jehovah's Witnesses were ever teaching it. But then one day, two witnesses knocked on my door, and I had conversations with witnesses before. And I was particularly intrigued by a few of their points. The idea of an end to war, an end to suffering, to sickness and disease, and that there would be this international brotherhood of human beings. I thought that was really attractive. And so I started studying, and I put studying in scare quotes here, because, as I mentioned earlier, witnesses have things that seem like it's education. In fact, a lot of their meetings look like a classroom, or at least they did. I haven't been in 10 years, so I don't know. but it's really an indoctrination session. And at that age, I wasn't educated enough or sophisticated enough to know the difference between what looks like a classroom and it's just sit down and we're gonna tell you what to think, not how to think. And so I was kind of mildly interested and went along for a while, but I wasn't really hooked in until um, I had something in my life happen that made me emotionally vulnerable. And I've since found out that that's when a lot of people get hooked into a cult. At the time, I was probably about 22 or 23. And then I started going to a lot of the meetings, and then it was the love bombing, and you just hear the message a lot. And it took me many years later until I realized that was when I really fell into the cult. And so one thing led to another. In the Orwellian year of 1984, I was baptized as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Ironic, no?
I loved reading that comment from you. I thought that shows so much retrospection from you to look at your experiences and say, now, isn't that interesting that I got baptized into the Jehovah's Witnesses in 1984?
A book which I've read several times since.
Once you were officially baptized into the witnesses, it's my understanding then that your responsibilities as a member of the organization changed considerably in terms of your door-to-door expectations and things like that. Is that right?
Well, yes, and it's always been sort of my personality. When I get interested in something, I dive into it pretty much head first, which can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. In this case, it turned out to be a bad thing. And so, kind of a little side point, a colleague, Rachel Bernstein, who is a psychologist, she made a comment also at the ICSA conference, the workshops in Montreal this last summer. She said two people can be in a group and have a different experience. It can be a cult for one person and not for another. And I thought that was just astounding. I was sort of gobsmacked when she said that. And so I realized that it was a cult for me, that's for sure. Because I dove in, I tried to be a good little Jehovah's Witness. I did everything I could. I tried to dot all my I's and cross all my T's. And so I relatively quickly sort of rose through the ranks. They have different positions. It's ironic. Witnesses love to bash the Catholic Church in particular. Witnesses bash every religion, but especially the Catholic Church. And yet they have a hierarchy that is almost identical for the number of tiers and levels in it. And so an elder is like a priest, but they have a thing called a ministerial servant that's sort of like a deacon. And so it was only a year or so I was appointed as a ministerial servant, which has the awesome responsibilities of carrying the microphone at the meetings and keeping track of minor paperwork. But then I was still a pretty young man when I was appointed as an elder. In retrospect, the term elder should have this meaning of years of experience and age and wisdom. But I was 30, which is not super young, but it's not really all that seasoned either. And again, in retrospect, the training and education we had was woefully inadequate to prepare us to deal with. We were supposed to counsel people who had serious life problems, whether it was marital issues or drug addiction or pornography or criminal or substance abuse. We were completely unequipped to handle those things. And yet, you somehow think if you just say a prayer to Jehovah and ask for Holy Spirit, you're going to be okay, which is really dangerous, actually, I have come to appreciate.
Coming up to my 30th birthday, and I know that I can't be in the position that you're in because I'm a woman, but
That's right.
I would not welcome the responsibility of deciding the fate of an individual who is perhaps about to be shunned. I would not enjoy that at all. And I imagine that that's not something that you ever enjoyed, but that there are many people in the organization that maybe do.
Well, that's a very interesting point. And yes, Jehovah's Witnesses, it's a very misogynistic religion. Women are definitely treated as second-class citizens in spite of a lot of hand waving and rhetoric to the contrary. They can say whatever they want, but if you just look at what they do, it's pretty clear. So yes, you clearly are aware of some of the policies and practices of witnesses. If a person breaks any of the rules, and there are many, as I said, then they can be subject to what's called a judicial committee, where 3 elders will get together and meet with that individual. And really, depending on whether they determine if the person is quote unquote repentant or not, will determine that person's fate. And if they're deemed to be unrepentant, they will be disfellowshipped. There'll be an announcement. And then that means everyone in the religion will shun them. Everyone. And all because of an announcement. And someone once said, well, what can a witness be disfellowshipped for? And there is a long list of things in their publications. There's a secret elders manual, which is not so secret. But if you're not an elder, you can't have it. And so that's a whole other travesty, right? People are expected to go to a meeting where no one can be with them. They can't have any representation. They're expected to go by a bunch of procedures based on rules that, unless you've been an elder, you wouldn't know what they are. You can't read about them. So it's really a star chamber. But again, someone would ask, well, what can a person be disfellowshipped for? And I once heard this sarcastic comment, but it's really on point. A person can be disfellowshipped for anything that 3 elders can agree upon. I wish your listeners could see your face right now. Or anything.
It's so profound when you put it that way. That from the judicial meetings that former ex-Jehovah's Witnesses have detailed in previous interviews on this show, I'm having like one of those moments of epiphany. That just sounds exactly like what's happened to these individuals, because the goalposts feel as if they've moved from one person's experience to the next, even if it feels like the individual who's coming forward to talk about a historical abuse that they've endured are risking being disfellowshipped themselves based on the determination of the elders involved in that judicial meeting. Wow, that's quite something, isn't it, really?
Well, it really is. And again, there are things like smoking, joining the military, practicing martial arts. The list is very, very long. Being drunk, not just drunkenness, but being drunk. And so many people have had the experience about, well, this one person did that and they were not disfellowshipped, and another person was, and they were disfellowshipped, but they got reinstated, and they were reinstated in only 6 months. Reinstated is the witness term for being allowed back into the flock, so to speak. Some people get reinstated in months. Some people, it takes years. Some people are never let back in. And what you brought about child sexual abuse is not something that I ever fortunately had to deal with in my years as an elder. Something for which I'm very grateful. But I knew about it when I was an elder, but we never dealt with it in any of the 2 congregations I was ever in. But often the organization will protect the predator at the expense of the victim, because they are more interested in officially preserving the organization's reputation. They'll say, we don't want to bring reproach upon Jehovah. That is the term. We don't want to bring reproach upon Jehovah or his name. But it's really about protecting the organization's reputation. That's the second layer. But the fact of the matter is, they just don't want to get sued and lose money. That's really the truth. Everything else is all bullshit. It really is. Ironically, I found out after I left, a couple of years after I left, that there had been a member of our congregation who had been abusing a young woman. He started grooming her when she was maybe even a preteen, but he started having a sexual relationship with her. And he was married and had kids. And he had been a ministerial servant in our congregation. He started having a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old girl, which continued until she turned 18. He was eventually arrested and spent a year in prison for that. But I didn't find out about this until many years after I had left the religion. So people are good sometimes at covering things up. And in fact, I've come to believe that cults often force people into leading double lives. Some people, that's who they are. But a lot of people, because of the potential consequences, they'll watch R-rated movies. They'll have too much to drink. They might sneak a cigarette or, smoke some weed or whatever, but they don't want to lose their families. So they just hide it and lie about it.
Something you mentioned before about what Rachel Bernstein had said about two people having different experiences in the same group. Right. I had that thought the other day when I was watching The Vow Part 2 on one person's experience of NXIVM compared to Nancy Salzman's experience of NXIVM. And of course, they're very difficult things to try and look at in writing because Nancy Salzman's a very special case in terms of the organization itself, and there's a lot that goes into her biases and her potential involvement in the things that were happening within NXIVM. And I emailed Janja Lalich because I was looking for a word that would encapsulate that exact thing. I released a series recently about Rajneesh, and I had so many Osho supporters come forward and say, you can't speak about Rajneesh that way, or you can't speak about Osho, because for some reason people can't reconcile the fact that they're the same person. And there were these interesting conversations on YouTube around how people were saying he changed people's lives, he was a true guru, which is not true, and we know that that's not true. But I was trying to say to people, your experience that was positive is not the same experience other people had, even if you were in the ashram in the same years. So I emailed Janja, and she responded and said, to me, it's a combination of three things. It's confirmation bias.
Yes.
It's belief bias, and it's cognitive dissonance, all acting as one thing to create this element of my experience was positive, and so your experience too must have also been positive. And I think that that's a really interesting concept to think about. And I can see why when Rachel spoke about it, you had the same sort of, that's really interesting.
Well, that's exactly right. So twice here in Los Angeles, I don't live in Los Angeles, but I live near it. Twice here in Los Angeles, I've attended ICSA workshops, and Rachel and a colleague of hers, Donnie Whitsitt, who's a professor of sociology and psychology at USC, they sponsored and moderated these two workshops I went to. One I just went as a participant, the other I presented at. And Donnie Whitsitt, she had us do a thing one time as a group where she asked a very difficult but important question. She said, we focus so much on the negative things about being in a cult. I want you to spend a few minutes and then share with the group, was there anything positive about it? And the reality is there was, which when we leave a high control group, we often are filled with so much anger and bitterness and a feel of betrayal and maybe embarrassment. Then how could I have fallen for that, right? That's overwhelming. It's important for us to recognize that there were positives, and that's really hard to tease out, right? Can I acknowledge that although it was overwhelmingly bad, wouldn't go back, that it wasn't all bad. And at least for me, one of the things that it confirmed that my love and passion for learning and teaching. So I mentioned a lot of the witness meetings look like school, and they have a thing they even call the Theocratic Ministry School. For 14 years, I conducted the Theocratic Ministry School. And it confirmed to me something that I wanted to do. When I was in my early 20s, I wanted to go to school and get a teaching credential and become a teacher for a lot of variety of reasons. Many reasons I wasn't able to pursue that until I was in my early 40s. And a lot of it had to do with, once I joined the cult, education is out. But it confirmed to me that I liked teaching. In fact, I loved teaching. I had a natural ability. I was good at it. And so when I decided to go back to school and I said, well, this is what real education is like. That's just indoctrination. That it was eye-opening to me. And so keeping on the thread about, was there anything positive about it? It was, I had a lot of experience doing public speaking. I was in front of the congregation several times a week. I got to give talks in front of groups at different congregations. So that got me comfortable in speaking in front of a group. Could I have learned those skills without ever belonging to a cult? Absolutely. Right. So that's the other dichotomy too. It's like, okay, there were some good things, and I had people I loved and people that I still miss, right? But that all ended. So yeah, it wasn't all bad, but even the good things could have been learned separately from that experience. So it does get complicated.
I feel as if that exercise could be a really good way for individuals to begin to reconcile everything that's been lost throughout many years spent in a high demand group, with the sunk cost fallacy, but also the grieving, as you've mentioned, the loss of family and friends and loved ones. If you're moving out of a group that does have a shunning policy, maybe that is a good first step into being able to reckon with all of those years that you can't get back, being able to look at things that were good, things that were positive, that you can take with you into your life away from the group. Because it must be devastating when you start to think about all of the things that could have been that you can't change.
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack. So on my teacher website, I have a little quote that I have borrowed from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and she was talking about children, but so I've sort of adapted it to be about students. She said children must be taught how to think, not what to think, and so that sort of underpins a lot of my philosophy about teaching, is teaching my students not what to think, not indoctrination, but how to think. And so to do that, I first had to learn how to think myself better. And so leaving the cult since 2009, so we were on 13 plus years here. The first couple of years were very disorienting. So there's, and I'm sure you've heard similar things from others you've interviewed. It's like, how the hell did I join this cult? Now I'm so lonely. I have nobody. How do I deal with that? What the hell do I believe? I don't believe this anymore. Is there anything from the group that I still believe? Right? Because I know I don't believe this. I don't believe that. And so that's super confusing. A lot of people just don't do the work because it's so difficult. And so they leave the group, but they haven't really left the group. I know a young man. We were very good friends. When I met him, he was 14. He was in the congregation that I spent most of my time in as a witness. When he was in his early 20s, he went to UCLA to get a degree in engineering, and he stopped going to meetings, but he didn't do the work he needed to do. And so we reconnected about 10 years after he had stopped being a witness, more or less. But although he was physically out of the organization, he was still mentally in it very much. And so in the last decade, we've spent a lot of time about talking about that whole process and how it involves so many different things to untangle those things. And it's difficult, but it's really very necessary work. And then the other thing you talked about is connecting with our authentic self. And for me, that was very hard, but I had an authentic self. I was someone before I joined the religion, and I lost that person. And so I had to reclaim that person. And there's also a big gap. 25 years is a lot of a person's life. Like I said, I wanted to go to college and get a teaching credential in my 20s. I didn't get to do that until my 40s. And so I've heard a lot of mostly ex-witnesses, but people in other cults. And I don't want to discount their emotions, but they bemoan what they've lost. And I get that. We should grieve that. But at some point, we also need to look at what we have left in life and what we can do with the time we have left, and figuring out who we are. There's a statement that's often attributed to George Eliot, but it's really someone else. Adelaide Ann Proctor. We always may be, we always may be what we might have been. And I don't know if that's 100% true, but as long as we have life and breath, there's opportunities to grow.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series. In part 2, Daniel and I discuss the shunning process and the consequences of this, followed in part 3 by a look at rebuilding an entire life post-Watchtower. To get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.